You ever get sued for protecting your own land? The first thing I heard that morning wasn't birds or whine through the cedar posts. It was the dry slap of legal paper hitting my front gate. I could smell fresh ink before I even unfolded it. That sharp, chemical scent mixing with the dust and sun-baked grass of my ranch. 47 acres, West Texas, been in my family since 1962. My grandfather used to say land like this doesn't just belong to you, you belong to it. And standing there in my boots, staring at a lawsuit filed by a woman who didn't even own a single inch of it, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Linda Whitmore, HOA president. I'd seen her before. White SUV, polished smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She ruled that little subdivision down the road like it was her own private kingdom. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and a long list of rules nobody voted for, but everybody followed. Problem was, her kingdom stopped at my fence line. Or at least, it was supposed to. A week earlier, I caught her standing right where my gravel path cuts through the north pasture, heels sinking into dirt she had no business touching. She smiled at me like we were neighbors sharing lemonade instead of strangers standing on opposite sides of a property line. Said the community needed access. Said it would be good for property values. I remember the way the wind rattled the barbed wire as I told her no. Calm. Simple. Final. She didn't like that. People like Linda don't hear no as an answer. They hear it as a challenge. Next thing I knew, survey flags started popping up like weeds along my fence. Bright orange, cheap plastic, hammered into ground my family bled for. Then came the sign. Future Community Access Road. Right there on my land. No permit. No agreement. Just assumption. I pulled it out myself, tossed it in the bed of my truck, figured that would be the end of it. I should have known better. Because people like Linda don't back down, they escalate. And now I was holding proof of it in my hands. A formal complaint. She was suing me for obstructing community development and denying lawful access. Lawful. I actually laughed when I read that part. Short, quiet, the kind of laugh that doesn't come from humor, but from recognition. The kind you get when you realize someone just made a very expensive mistake. The gate creaked behind me as I pushed it closed, the metal vibrating under my hand. I looked out over the pasture, sun just starting to burn off the morning haze, and for a second, everything felt still, like the land itself was waiting to see how I'd respond. I folded the papers carefully, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it under my arm. Linda thought she was dragging me into a fight I couldn't win. Thought she was dealing with some stubborn ranch owner who didn't understand how the system worked. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that I'd spent 30 years inside that system, and I knew exactly how to break it without raising my voice once. I have always believed you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat a boundary, especially one they did not build. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for the better part of 3 decades, I made a living studying those boundaries, testing them, and, when necessary, tearing them apart in a courtroom. Before this ranch, before the quiet mornings and the smell of dry cedar and sun-warmed soil, I wore pressed suits instead of worn denim and spent my days under fluorescent lights instead of open sky. Property law, land disputes, contract enforcement, that was my world. I knew every angle, every loophole, every line people tried to blur when they thought no one was watching. When I walked away from that life 5 years ago, it was not because I lost the fight. It was because I had won enough of them to know exactly what they cost. This land was supposed to be the opposite of that. 47 acres of silence, of wind moving through grass like a slow tide, of fence lines that meant something because they were earned, not negotiated. My grandfather bought this place with cash he saved fixing engines and hauling freight, and he marked every inch himself, post by post, wire by wire. I still remember the way his hands looked, rough and steady, as he showed me where our property ended and the rest of the world began. That line mattered to him. It matters to me, which is why when Linda Whitmore stepped over it like it was a suggestion instead of a fact, I paid attention. Not because I was angry, not yet, but because I recognized the pattern. The confidence, the assumption, the quiet belief that rules only apply to other people. I had seen it 100 times before, usually from behind a polished desk with a client sitting across from me asking how far they could push before it became a problem. The answer was always the same. It becomes a problem when someone like me decides it is one. I set the lawsuit down on my kitchen table, the wood scarred from years of use. and poured myself a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm in the Texas heat. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock and the faint hum of wind slipping through the screen door. I read every page slowly, not because I needed to, but because details matter. They always do. Linda had not just filed a complaint. She had built a narrative, claimed historical access rights, implied shared usage, even referenced non-existent agreements that sounded official enough to scare someone who did not know better. It was clean on the surface, almost convincing if you ignored the parts that did not exist. That was her mistake. She thought she was creating pressure. What she was really doing was leaving fingerprints. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and let the silence stretch. Most people, when they get served papers like this, they panic. They call the first lawyer they can find, throw money at the problem, hope it goes away. I did none of that. Instead, I folded the documents neatly, set them beside a stack of old county records I had not touched in years, and let a small, almost invisible smile settle in. Linda believed she had dragged me into her fight. She believed the courtroom was her battlefield. What she did not understand was simple. I did not step into that world. I built my entire life inside it. And she had just handed me exactly what I needed to walk back in on my own terms. I did not drive into town that day right away, even though most people would have. Instead, I walked the north fence line again, boots crunching over dry gravel, the sun already climbing high enough to press heat into the back of my neck. The wire hummed softly in the wind, that low metallic vibration you only notice when everything else is quiet. That fence had been standing longer than Linda Whitmore had probably lived in Texas, and every post told the same story. This is where it ends. Except now there were new marks along the edge, shallow tire impressions cutting too close to the boundary, footprints where no one had permission to stand, and a pair of fresh stakes hammered into the ground about 10 yards inside my property line. Bright orange. Careless. The kind of mistake you make when you think no one is going to push back. I crouched down and pulled one of them free, the wood sliding out of the dirt with a soft, gritty resistance, and turned it over in my hand. No survey stamp, no official marking, just a cheap flag meant to create the illusion of authority. I tossed it into the bed of my truck beside the sign I had already removed and let my eyes follow the line they were trying to claim. It ran straight through my pasture, cut across a shallow drainage dip, and aimed directly toward the subdivision road like it had always been meant to connect. Clean, convenient, completely fabricated. Back at the house, I spread out the old county plats across my kitchen table, the paper yellowed and slightly curled at the edges, smelling faintly of dust and time. I traced the boundaries with my finger, following the same lines my grandfather had once shown me, comparing them to the claims in Linda's filing. She had built her case on suggestion, on language that sounded official without actually being correct. Words like customary access, implied use, community necessity. None of them meant anything without documentation. And there was none. What she did have, though, was momentum. I had seen it before. Someone pushes just far enough, creates just enough visible change, and suddenly it looks like it has always been that way. People stop questioning it. That is how bad claims become accepted facts. That is how land changes hands without a single legal transfer. I pulled open a drawer and took out a folder I had not touched in years, thick, organized, every document labeled in clean, precise handwriting. Deeds, surveys, tax records, photographs going back decades, proof layered on proof. I flipped through it slowly, not searching, just reminding myself what was there. Every piece of paper was a line Linda could not cross, even if she believed she already had. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second measured, controlled, and I felt that old rhythm settle back into place in my head. The one I used to carry into courtrooms where people thought volume could replace facts. Outside, a truck passed on the distant road, the sound fading quickly into the open space, leaving nothing but wind and quiet again. I closed the folder, set it neatly beside the lawsuit, and reached for my keys. If Linda wanted to turn this into a legal matter, then that is exactly what it was going to become. Not loud, not rushed, precise. Because the moment you step into a fight like this, the outcome is not decided by who speaks first. It is decided by who understands the ground they are standing on. And I had been standing on mine my entire life. I did not go to a lawyer's office when I reached town, and that alone would have surprised anyone watching this unfold from the outside. Instead, I parked across the street from the county records building, engine ticking as it cooled, the late morning heat pressing against the windshield like a heavy hand. The place had not changed in 20 years. Same faded brick, same narrow steps, same faint smell of paper and dust that hit you the second you pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, broken only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant shuffle of someone turning pages. I nodded to the clerk behind the counter, a woman who had probably seen more property disputes than most attorneys, and signed the log without saying much. No need to explain. The system does not care about stories, only records. I moved toward the back where the older plats and filings were stored, fingers brushing along metal drawers until I found the section I wanted. Willowbrook. Estates. Of course. I pulled the file and set it on the table, the weight of it settling with a dull thud that echoed just enough to draw a glance from across the room. Paperwork like this always tells the truth if you give it time. I flipped through slowly, page by page, eyes scanning for patterns instead of words. Development approvals, zoning adjustments, subdivision layouts, all clean on the surface, all stamped and signed in the right places. Linda had done her homework, or at least paid someone to make it look like she had. But then I found it. A small addendum buried between two larger filings, the kind most people would skip because it did not look important. Boundary Acknowledgement Agreement. I felt the corner of my mouth tighten slightly as I read it through. The developer who built that subdivision had formally recognized my ranch as a separate, non-participating property. No shared access. No easements. No future claims without written consent. My consent. The ink was old, but the language was clear, and more importantly, it had been recorded properly. That meant it did not matter what Linda believed or what she told her board. The law had already drawn the line for her years before she ever showed up. I made a copy, then another, the machine clicking and humming in steady rhythm, each page sliding out warm and precise. Evidence does not need to be dramatic. It just needs to be undeniable. On my way out, I stopped at the bulletin board near the entrance where public notices were pinned in neat rows. And there it was, a freshly posted notice from the HOA, announcing a proposed infrastructure expansion, including a planned access corridor connecting their main road to adjacent land. Adjacent land. They had already started telling the story publicly, laying groundwork so when the path appeared, it would feel inevitable instead of illegal. I studied it for a moment, taking in the clean font, the confident language, the quiet assumption that no one would challenge it. Then I stepped back into the heat, the sunlight sharp enough to make me narrow my eyes. The wind carried the faint smell of asphalt from somewhere down the road, construction already in motion. Linda was not waiting for permission. She was building momentum. I slid the copied documents into my folder, climbed back into my truck, and let the engine turn over with a low, steady rumble. Most people would have felt pressure at this point. A lawsuit filed, land being marked, a narrative forming against them. But pressure only matters if you let it move you. I rested my hand on the steering wheel and looked out toward the direction of my ranch, miles of open land stretching beyond sight. She thought this was about access, about a shortcut, about expanding her control a few more feet at a time. What she did not understand was that she had just confirmed something far more important. She had no legal ground to stand on. And now, neither did her case. I did not respond to the lawsuit right away, and that was intentional. Most people think silence means weakness, that if you do not push back immediately, you are already losing. But in my experience, silence is one of the most effective tools you can use when the other side is building their own case against themselves. I spent the next 2 days on the ranch, moving through my normal routine like nothing had changed, checking the south fence, walking the perimeter at sunrise, listening to the low hum of wind moving across open land. But I was not just observing the land. I was watching them. By the second afternoon, I heard it before I saw it, the distant grind of tires on gravel that did not belong to me, followed by the slow approach of a work truck coming up along the subdivision edge. I stayed where I was, just far enough back to see without being seen clearly, and waited. 2 men stepped out, both wearing reflective vests, carrying measuring wheels and clipboards. Contractors, not surveyors. That detail mattered. Surveyors document reality. Contractors build over it. They rolled that wool right across my boundary line without hesitation, marking distances, speaking in low voices, pointing toward the same stretch of land Linda had claimed in her filing. One of them drove another orange stake into the ground, deeper this time, more deliberate, like they were trying to make it permanent through repetition. I could smell fresh dirt and diesel drifting across the pasture, mixing with the dry scent of grass and sun. That was my first confirmation. She was not waiting for a ruling. She was trying to create one. I turned back toward the house without saying a word, boots pressing steady into the soil, and pulled my phone from my pocket. I did not call anyone. I opened the camera. From the porch, I zoomed in just enough to capture what mattered: the truck logo, the license plate, the exact placement of those stakes relative to my fence line. Clear. Undeniable. Evidence is not about quantity. It is about precision. Every frame I recorded was another piece of a puzzle Linda did not realize she was completing for me. That evening, I sat at the same kitchen table, the same stack of documents spread out under the soft yellow light overhead. The lawsuit, the county records, the boundary agreement, now paired with fresh images of unauthorized work being done on land that had already been legally defined decades ago. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second measured, each moment adding weight to what was already forming. Most people, at this point, would feel the need to confront, to drive down to that subdivision, knock on Linda's door, demand answers. I did not, because confrontation gives people a chance to adjust, to correct, to cover their tracks, and Linda was not careful enough to deserve that advantage. Instead, I reached for a legal pad and began writing, not arguments, not yet, but a timeline. Dates, times, actions, every detail placed in order with the same discipline I had used in courtrooms for years. Patterns emerge when you slow things down. Intent becomes visible when behavior repeats. By the time I set the pen down, the picture was clear. She had filed a lawsuit based on a claim that did not exist, publicly announced a project she had no authority to execute, and now had contractors physically marking land she did not own. That is not a misunderstanding. That is overreach. And overreach, when documented properly, does not just lose cases. It ends them. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet settle in around me, and let that realization sit for a moment. Linda thought she was applying pressure, forcing me into a defensive position, making me react. But all she had really done was give me time. Time to watch, to document, to let her move first and move wrong. And the more she moved, the more certain the outcome became. The judge did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. I could hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock somewhere behind me, each second stretching just a little longer than the last as the documents sat on the bench, waiting to be considered. Linda's attorney shifted again, less confident now, his earlier rhythm broken, while Linda herself sat perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes when control starts slipping but you are not ready to admit it yet. I stood where I was, hands relaxed, breathing steady, not adding anything, not interrupting the moment. Because once the evidence is in place, the best move is to let it stand on its own. The judge finally looked up, eyes moving from the documents to me, then briefly to Linda and her attorney, measuring, weighing, connecting everything that had been laid out. The court finds that the plaintiff has failed to establish any legal right to access the defendant's property, he said, voice calm, direct, without excess. The words landed clean. No hesitation. No room for interpretation. I felt the shift settle completely then, not as a surge of victory, but as a quiet confirmation of something that had already been decided long before we stepped into that room. But he was not finished. Furthermore, he continued, glancing back down at the submitted materials, the documented actions taken by the plaintiff and associated parties following the filing of this complaint raised serious concerns regarding unauthorized use and representation of property boundaries. That was the part Linda had not prepared for, the part that turned her pressure into liability. Her attorney attempted to respond, a quick, controlled effort to redirect, but it lacked the structure it had before, the foundation already gone. The judge raised a hand slightly, enough to pause him, without force, and continued. The complaint is dismissed. The court will also be reviewing the submitted documentation for potential additional proceedings related to these actions. There it was. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Linda's composure broke in small ways first, a tightening of her jaw, a slight shift in her posture, The kind of controlled reaction someone uses when they realize the outcome is no longer theirs to shape. She did not speak. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say in that room. I gathered my documents slowly, the same measured movements I had used all along, sliding each page back into the folder with care, aligning the edges, closing it with a quiet finality that felt more significant than any raised voice ever could. As I stepped out of the courtroom, the air outside felt different, warmer, carrying the faint scent of sun-heated pavement and distant dust. The parking lot was quieter now, the earlier tension gone, replaced by the normal rhythm of people moving through their day. I paused for a moment beside my truck, looking out toward the open road that led back to the ranch, miles of land stretching beyond sight, unchanged, exactly as it had been before any of this started. Linda thought she was using the law as leverage, something to push, to shape, to bend in her favor. What she never understood was that the law does not respond to pressure. It responds to precision. And precision does not need to be loud. It does not need to rush. It just needs to be right. I climbed into the truck, the engine turning over with a steady, familiar sound, and pulled back onto the road, leaving the courthouse behind without looking back. By the time I reached the ranch, the sun was already starting to drop, casting long shadows across the pasture, the fence line stretching clean and unbroken across the land. I stepped out, closed the gate behind me, and let the quiet settle in again, the wind moving through the grass like nothing had ever changed. Because in the end, nothing had. The line was still there. It had always been there. She just finally saw it.